I'm really enthusiastic to introduce you to Hugh Hurwitz, who is going to tell us about his distinguished career with the Bureau of Prisons. And we've been working together on a series of questions that we thought his responses may be helpful to people who are approaching a prison sentence or defense attorneys who may be representing people that are approaching a prison sentence. And I'd like to begin by just welcoming you, Hugh, to our program. And perhaps you could give us a brief introduction on your background and how you came to work with the Bureau of Prisons.
Great. Well, thanks, Michael. It's great to be here, so I appreciate it. I actually have a pretty unique background compared to most people in the Bureau of Prisons. I have not spent my entire career at BOP. I completed last year a 29-year federal career at 4 different agencies, but I also worked some time in private practice. My career started actually in BOP in 1988 as an intern in their Office of General Counsel. I was in law school at the time and came to work for BOP, worked there in the summer, and then stayed and continued on during the school year. After I graduated law school, I was a clerk at the DC Court of Appeals for a year, and then I came back to the Bureau of Prisons in their General Counsel's office as an attorney. I worked there for a few years and then left for private practice. And, you know, I know a lot of lawyers will look at this, but I hated being a lawyer. And it was not what I wanted to do. But I did enjoy the Bureau of Prisons. So I actually came back to the Bureau of Prisons after my law practice and went back into the Bureau of Prisons in their procurement office. I had several positions in the procurement office, ultimately becoming their chief of procurement. I left BOP at that time for a number of leadership positions at the Food and Drug Administration, Department of Education, and then NASA. But I really had this desire to return to the Bureau of Prisons, and an opportunity opened up, and I went back as the Senior Deputy Assistant Director for Information Policy and Public Affairs. And in that role, it was really a great role for me because that role gave me an opportunity to see everything that BOP does. I supervise the Office of Public Affairs, the Office of Legislative Affairs, the Office of Research, and the Office of Policy. And those offices really touch everything that Bureau of Prisons does, because everything BOP does either has Congress or the media interested in it. It involves policy and it involves research. So I really got exposed to everything that BOP did. And then I took that experience and became the Assistant Director for Reentry Services Division. And the Bureau of Prisons has 2 missions, right? It's half the mission is to safely and securely confine offenders, and the other half is to prepare them to return to society. 95% of the people in BOP's custody are going to come home to our communities. So the other half of their mission is to make sure they're ready for reentry. So that half of the mission is what I was responsible for as the Assistant Director in Reentry Services. I then had the opportunity, I was appointed by the Attorney General to be acting director, where I spent 15 months in that role. And then I went back to my old job as Assistant Director of Reentry Services Division, and then completed my career there as Assistant Director of Administration Division, kind of going back to the beginning and supervising procurement and financial management, where I started. So that's my long and winding career in the Bureau of Prisons.
When as the Director of Reentry Services, could you tell us a little bit about the training that goes into helping staff members in the Bureau of Prisons understand the importance of preparing for reentry?
Well, you know, BOP has a number of different training programs. They do a lot to try and train their own staff, and particularly leadership development training programs. And it starts at the beginning. It starts when they go to the Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, and understanding that, you know, what reentry is, what the programs are that we offer, and why it's important. And as I said before, 95% of our population are going back to our community. So, you know, reentry is critically important to our communities, because we all want people that are going to come back and be successful. We don't want them to come back to our communities and then recidivate. So the training begins early on in the BOP, and the directors for the last several years have all considered reentry so important that they kind of use a catchphrase saying reentry begins on the first day of incarceration. And the focus is on that very first day that we're already looking to figure out what we can do to prepare our population for returning to society.
You said that was over the last several years. And I started my sentence in 1987 and didn't conclude until 2013, before reentry was really a buzzword in the community. And while I was in prison, I remember a lot of times being told that we don't care anything about your life after you get out. We're primarily concerned with the security of the institution. Could you tell us what prompted that shift and when that shift began, that the Bureau of Prisons put an emphasis on reentry? Because that happened after I got out.
Sure. So there was always some aspects of reentry that Bureau of Prisons did. I mean, let's be clear. What is reentry, right? What is reentry program? Reentry programming includes things like education, religious services, mental health treatment, psychology services, and halfway houses. So those programs all existed long before you were in the Bureau of Prisons. But they were, as you say, kind of an afterthought. They were things that we were supposed to do, but the primary concern was safety and security. Because as you say, once people leave the Bureau of Prisons, it's not our problem. When Charles Samuels was director of the Bureau of Prisons, he created the Reentry Services Division. So those programs I talked about were all in different parts of the Bureau of Prisons in different divisions, and different people had responsibility for those programs. When Charles came in, he created the Reentry Service Division and combined those and really started making reentry a focus of the Bureau of Prisons. And then that continued when the Obama administration came in, and Sally Yates was the Deputy Attorney General, and she had a big focus on reentry as well. And she helped the Bureau of Prisons trying to continue that process even after Charles left. So it's really, I credit it to starting with Charles Samuels during his leadership time.
And I've seen, of course, this is what we're going to be doing in this series of Q&A, is helping people who are in the system understand, I think, that historical perspective, because there is a shift now in the Bureau of Prisons, particularly with the passage of the First Step Act and this shift in policy that, in my view, is one of the biggest prison reform, sentence reform movements in 30 plus years since the 1994 Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which introduced RDAP. Could you tell us a little bit about the rollout of the BOP's response to the First Step Act?
Sure, and you're 100% correct. I mean, the First Step Act was probably the most significant criminal justice reform legislation in a generation. So it's really important. I was director when the First Step Act was passed. I was working with the administration very closely in not only in its passage, but in the initial implementation of the First Step Act. But before I really answer your question, I think it's important to note, on a general sense, my personal opinion, I feel there's a need to look at our sentence laws in this country. And the kind of the mantra I use is to ensure that only the right people go to prison for the right amount of time. As a country, especially when compared to other countries, we put too many people in prison for far too long a period of time. And I believe the First Step Act was, at least in part, intended to address the length of time that people are in prison and to reduce the overall prison population. But to me, I think the First Step Act actually fell short of some of the most meaningful reform opportunities, because they only looked at the Bureau of Prisons. They only looked at what they call back-end reforms, which is changing how Bureau of Prisons operates, and nothing was done on sentence reform and changing how long people are sentenced for in the first place. So I think there's still great opportunity to do more in this area, and maybe that will be the Second Chance Act, or whatever they want to call it. But that's really the next phase of where we need to go. But in any event, after passage of the First Step Act, the first thing the Bureau of Prisons did was to work with the National Institute of Justice, which is another arm of the Department of Justice, to develop a new risk assessment tool. The First Step Act called for us to create this tool. Bureau of Prisons already had a tool we called Bravo. And that was a risk assessment tool which was designed to look at risk of institution misconduct. And what we found through our own research is that it also did a pretty good job at predicting recidivism. But because the First Step Act called for us to create a new tool, we worked with NIJ and created a tool that actually is not significantly different than Bravo, but does tweak some of the factors and look at things a little bit differently. And this tool is called the Prisoner Assessment Tool Targeting Risk and Needs. Now that's a mouthful. So take the first letter of each of those words and you spell pattern. So pattern is the name of the tool, and pattern looks at 17 individual risk factors. I'm not going to list them all, but they look at things like age at first arrest, violence of the instant offense, criminal history, infractions while someone's incarcerated, and what programs they complete while they're incarcerated. And so today, pattern is now used to score each incarcerated individual in the BOP based on these factors, and that measures their risk of recidivism, and it gives them a score. And the score becomes very important, as you'll see here in a few minutes. But before I get to that, the BOP also developed another tool, and this tool was to assess the criminogenic needs of each individual. So first you have the tool looking at risk factors, and then you have to figure out what their needs are so you can treat their needs in order to lower their risk factor. So this tool is called the Standardized Prisoner Assessment for Reduction in Criminality, another mouthful. So they call that SPARC 13. The 13 represents the 13 needs areas that the BOP assesses. Those areas are anger, hostility, antisocial peers, antisocial cognitions, education, family, parenting, finance and poverty, medical needs, mental health needs, recreation, leisure, and fitness, substance use history, trauma history, work, and dyslexia. And dyslexia was added in because that was specifically called for in the First Step Act, unlike the others, which BOP determined to be the most influential on needs. So today, every inmate is assessed at intake on both their pattern and SPARC 13 evaluations, and they're required to be reassessed at least once a year. So now what happens? I'm sorry.
No, please continue.
So now we have these two tools. So now what do they do with them, right? In addition to scoring individuals using these tools, the First Step Act required the BOP to offer programming in order to meet the individual needs that are identified in these tools. And so to encourage individuals to take that programming, the First Step Act provides some individuals the opportunity to earn time credits for successful program participation. And if you give me 1 minute, I'll explain the time credit in a moment. The programs that must be considered are called evidence-based recidivism reducing programs, EBRRs for short, or productive activities. And you can look at the statute for the difference, but it isn't at this point all that significant. So what did BOP do? They developed a catalog of approved First Step Act programs. This catalog can be found on their website. It's updated periodically. The initial version of the catalog were all programs that BOP already had in operation. And as I noted, inmates completing any of these programs are eligible to earn time credits, allowing them to be placed in supervised release or pre-release custody sooner. And that's really a significant element in the First Step Act, because previously you really couldn't get out of prison through very many ways other than completing your sentence. You get some good conduct time or completing the RDAP program. There really isn't a lot of ways to do anything to help speed up your release, but this offers the opportunity for some inmates to move to supervised release or pre-release custody sooner. As I said, some inmates, not all inmates, are eligible to apply their time. Everyone's eligible to earn time credits, but not everyone's eligible to apply them toward early release. The First Step Act first only allows those deemed to be minimum or low risk as being eligible. So that's why that pattern score becomes important. And that's why they do those reassessments, because as you do more, you can reduce your pattern score to become minimum or low risk. And then you can't have committed any of a number of disqualifying offenses, which quite frankly, mostly these are crimes of violence, sex offenses, terrorism, things like that. But interestingly, that list as it stands today amounts to almost half the BOP population of not being eligible to apply those time credits. But again, that's the importance of that pattern score we talked about.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out something to the people who are in the system is that there's also the custody and classification scoring system, which plays a big role in where a person serves his or her sentence. In the past, it's really been focused on static scores where you can't change anything about the past, but regardless of what good you do, it didn't really matter. There was no way, there was a million ways that you could increase your security level. There was no way other than the passing of calendar pages to reduce your reduce your thing. I mean, you couldn't change it. This pattern, this whole First Step Act completely changed that dynamic in that now there are these dynamic factors that the person's behavior in prison can result in lowering their risk assessment and exposing them to higher levels of liberty at a sooner time. How public is the Bureau of Prisons making it available to access? What is the pattern score, and what is that second test that you mentioned?
The Spark 13.
The Spark 13. Are both of those available online for somebody to study and learn?
The individual scores of an individual inmate are not available, and they're available to that individual. So
no, the form itself. If I'm going in and I want to find out about Spark, I want to learn about it so I can start architecting a strategy that I'm participating in a way that gets the maximum benefit. Can I see that before I go to prison?
The pattern, the criteria used in pattern and the scoring system for pattern is available online. Actually, it's not a BOP site, but actually I think it's, well, there is at least one organization out there that actually has a tool that you can go in and plug in your criteria into their tool and it'll kick out the score. It's very, very similar to what the tool BOP uses. So there is that tool out there available on pattern. On Spark 13, it's more of an assessment of, it's really very individual. So when, so for parenting, that's a very simple assessment. Are you a parent? Yes or no? For trauma, it's really more of an interview thing about those. Some of them, they'll look at their pre-sentence report and get some of the information, but a lot of that is very individual based. And as far as I know, the scoring on that is not available out there, but it's really a yes or no. Do you have a need? So it's identifying those 13 need areas, and it's pretty easy to tell whether you have a need in those 13 areas.
One of the projects that we'll create as part of this course is I will look for that pattern information and I will provide that so that anybody is watching this on video or visiting the Prison Professor's website can access it. And I'm also going to give responses on why I think this is so important in different areas as somebody who's gone through the journey in prisons of every security level. Tell us about how your interpretation of how the staff throughout the Bureau, it's a huge agency, has responded to this really complete shift in focus where we are focusing on dynamic factors and really incentivizing a person's adjustment to pursue good behavior in prison.
Well, as you can imagine, and you said, right, BOP is a large organization. There's some 36,000 staff across the country. So it's been a learning curve, and it's still a learning curve, right? The BOP is issued policy and issuing direction out to the institutions, but it's taking time for everybody to understand what the goals are and what the expectations are. And some information gets passed down better than others. And as you can imagine, if you ever played the game of telephone, somebody hears one thing and 3 people later, 4 people later, it's a completely different story. So there's, of course, problems like that throughout BOP, but they are now that they have a process where everybody is getting scored in pattern, everybody is getting scored in Spark, and they have programs in place. Now it's a matter of just getting people taking those programs, The meetings, really the critical meetings, are with the individual case managers in your teaming sessions, so that you can understand what are your needs. Let's decide what programs you need to take to meet those needs, and then let's get you going there. And that's really where the rubber meets the road there, and that's the important conversations need to happen. And I think BOP is doing a much better job at that now.
How is the BOP doing in expanding the number of programs that would qualify for earned time credits?
So as I said, BOP issued the first set of programs by basically taking the programs that they had that fell into either EBRR or productive activity categories, and that was their initial publication of their list. They now have a process where an individual, an organization outside of BOP, or even a staff member could propose a program. And there's a form on their website to fill out. You fill out the form, it goes into BOP. They have an outside contractor to give some level of independence to do an initial assessment of that proposed program. Does it meet the criteria, the First Step Act? Is it an EBRR? Is PA? What are the cost factors? It doesn't mean that they wouldn't approve something that's costly, but it just, that's another criteria that needs to be considered. And they would identify all of these factors and criteria and make a recommendation to BOP. That then goes to the Reentry Services Division, and they'll assess the program. They're looking at, do we have other programs similar to it, things like that. And then ultimately, if they agree to add that program, it'll be added to the catalog. And so that's the process that's taking place today.
In what ways is the Bureau of Prisons making use of technology to disseminate more programs, such as access to video courses? And, like outside, of course, we have access to lynda.com, where I learned a lot about technology. Does the Bureau of Prisons have plans to use technology more on an individual basis to provide courses that might make people prepared for success upon release?
Sure. Well, actually, so the BOP just recently awarded a contract for tablets that would be available to individual inmates for programming purposes. And I don't think they've started rolling out the tablets yet in the pilot institutions, but they are developing those tablets now. They have a vendor in place that will have tablets eventually in the hands of all the inmates in order to facilitate programming. And what that does is it really makes things much, much better. First of all, you have situations like we had with COVID where institutions were locked down, you couldn't go to programming. Well, this would allow people to continue programming in their cells. But it also adds to the programming capabilities because A, there's going to be online only programs, and B, people will be able to continue learning when they're not in class or in programs, because they'll be able to take that back to their cell or bunk and continue the programming that they learned earlier in the day. So it's a great opportunity, and it's great to see the Bureau of Prisons really catching up to many other states that are already using tablets.
And with regard to the First Step Act and this strategy or this provision of the First Step Act that allows people in prison to petition first the BOP and then their sentencing judge for compassionate release, could you tell us how the BOP assesses whether somebody is a worthy candidate for compassionate release and how the First Step Act plays into these decisions?
Sure. So the First Step Act changed how compassionate release works. Previously, before the First Step Act, only the Bureau of Prisons could file a motion with the court for compassionate release. Ultimately, it's a judge's call, but BOP plays a big role in any event. So previous to the First Step Act, BOP would consider a request for compassionate release. The standard was extraordinary and compelling circumstances. To be honest, most of the time, BOP only would file compassionate release in the most serious cases where an individual was dying, they were in a terminal state and imminently in danger of death. The First Step Act changed that process. The First Step Act now allows for an individual to file directly with the court for compassionate release. if the Bureau of Prisons has not acted within 30 days. So you file your request with the warden at your individual institution. BOP has 30 days to act, and if they don't act on day 31, you can file in court. And to be honest, 30 days is a really short time frame for BOP, and so it's fairly common for them to not act within that 30 days, and then you could file directly with the court. And the result is that a lot of inmates filed for compassionate release cases in court, even more so during the pandemic.
I'll turn to the CARES Act after this quick follow-up to that. Previously, when I was in prison, I was told there was a policy, maybe it was an unwritten policy, maybe it was a policy, when I'd ask staff members with whom I had a direct relationship to write their recommendation on or an assessment or a letter, if I was maybe to accompany a petition for clemency or something along those lines. And frequently I would hear that there was a rule that they weren't allowed to do that, or they were discouraged from writing those letters of recommendation. In light of the First Step Act, and in light of the fact that staff members are really close with people who they're supervising, has that changed? Has the BOP changed its policy of allowing staff members to give an assessment on a person's adjustment to prison?
Yeah, I have not seen a change to a written policy in that regard. It makes sense that there would be some opportunities to get that input. It puts BOP, some of the staff, sometimes in a tough position to do that. And as you said, they've been really reluctant to do that as much as possible. Now they do assist in getting jobs and will validate that you took certain programs and you completed them successfully, things like that. But they are generally loath to make recommendations. And I haven't. It's something that may change. I haven't seen policy on that as of yet.
It's something that if you're going into the prison system, you might want to think about, is that if you don't get the response that you want from the Bureau of Prisons and you're going to file in federal court, you're really going to want to advocate for yourself in the best way. And staff members can be a great source for a judge to consider about your adjustment in prison. So if it's possible in your institution, it's something I would urge you to think about. But you'd mentioned during COVID and the CARES Act. Could you differentiate or help us understand the difference between compassionate release with the First Step Act and compassionate release with the CARES Act?
So the CARES Act actually doesn't directly address compassionate release, but logically one would think with being so many people at high risk, especially in a prison, for contracting and dying of COVID-19, those circumstances would rise to the level of extraordinary and compelling circumstances that's required for compassionate release to be granted. Now, I will say that BOP during the COVID was still reluctant to use that as a basis for granting, for recommending to the judge compassionate release. They generally took the position that they would rather move an individual to home confinement, which the CARES Act did allow them to do within their own discretion, and because that was a less risky move, right? Somebody going to home confinement is still in the custody of the Attorney General. Somebody who's released under compassionate release is now no longer an inmate. They are a regular citizen, free to do whatever. And if they were to do something that they're illegal or violate the laws, they would have to be re-prosecuted. Where if they're on home confinement, you just pull them back in. And so BOP was, for the most part, reluctant to use compassionate release in a greater extent during the pandemic. But we did see large numbers of compassionate release filings by inmates. The 30-day that the First Step Act now allows. There were large numbers of filings by inmates because the First Step Act allowed it. The result was, and I have some statistics here, the result was that the courts granted 12 times more compassionate release requests in 2020 than in the first year of the First Step Act. And 96% of those requests were filed by inmates on their own motion and not BOP. So that tells you that, the judges thought that the pandemic was a reason for granting compassionate release. But it looks like BOP was not the genesis of those requests.
And it's important for people going into the prison system to see that relationship on the importance of avoiding disciplinary infractions and participating in courses, so that when these opportunities open, and they open rarely, for a stakeholder to assess whether you are more appropriate to go to home confinement or stay in prison or even get compassionate release, a lot of it has to do with an individual's efforts at self-advocacy and documenting a journey through prison of preparing for success. There was a series of memorandums that the Bureau of Prisons published at the start of the pandemic, speaking about a 25% rule, that if a person served 25% of their sentence, they may be transitioned to home confinement, and 50% if their sentence was, I think, over 18 months. Could you elaborate a little bit on those percentages, and if they're still if that policy or that memorandum is still in place?
Sure. So the CARES Act granted the Bureau of Prisons the ability to move more people to home confinement as a safety measure, right? To get people. Prisons are not conducive to social distancing, and especially at the height of the pandemic, the prisons had significant COVID cases across the country. So the CARES Act allowed them to move people to home confinement. And as you said, if you'd served 50% of your sentence, that was one of the criteria. If you had a shorter sentence, it was 25%. And there were other criteria as well that they used with the Attorney General. They couldn't be crimes of violence, couldn't be sex offenders, couldn't be terrorists. There's a number of other criteria as well that the BOP considered in using that. That is still in place today. The CARES Act, the CARES Act granted the Attorney General really the authority to direct BOP to do this until the pandemic is declared over. So as of today, the president hasn't declared the pandemic to be over. So the CARES Act and these home confinement placements are still available for people to be considered. If you meet all of the criteria, the institution makes the recommendation. It's a pretty simple process. There are people, they have discretion in some cases to expand beyond some of that criteria. If the institution believes an individual should get home confinement under the CARES Act, they can submit that to a committee in central office that reviews it. That committee will talk to the U.S. Attorney's Office that prosecuted to see if they have any objections, and that becomes a little more challenging right now. But that process is still available, at least as long as the pandemic is declared in place.
It's important for people to realize that does not liberate them or make their sentences done in 25%. They are serving the remainder of that sentence on home confinement. And while they're on home confinement, could you talk a little bit about the level of liberty they have? Do they have the opportunity to go to work? Do they have the opportunity to go to school? What do those restrictions look like while somebody's serving the remaining 75% of the sentence on home confinement?
And these rules for home confinement apply whether you're serving home confinement under the CARES Act or whether you're a regular inmate who didn't qualify under the CARES Act but gets a home confinement placement, which oftentimes happens toward the end of one sentence. In any event, as I said, you're still under the custody of the Attorney General. You still have to follow Bureau of Prisons rules. For the most part, many of them are electronically monitored, either wearing an electronic bracelet. There are some that are using some cell phone technology now that will monitor them that way. They can go to work. They're expected to go to work. They're expected, if they are taking classes or in education, they're expected to go to education, expected to go to the doctor, and otherwise they're at home. And they can work with the home confinement program is managed by the halfway houses that are contracted by BOP. So they will probably check in at a local halfway house periodically, and the halfway house will check in on them to make sure that they're following the rules and doing what they should do. And then if you need to go somewhere else that isn't part of your pre-planned education, work, medical, what have you, you can make that request, and if it's approved, they'll allow you to transfer, to go wherever it is you need to go. But generally, when you're not doing those things, you're at home. It's home confinement.
And they're under the Second Chance Act, which preceded the First Step Act. Second Chance was signed by the first President Bush. It authorized, as I recall, a person to get up to 1 year of time in a residential reentry center, and they could serve up to 10% of their sentence or a maximum of 6 months on home confinement. That was under the Second Chance Act. Did the First Step Act open that window of time for people to go on to home confinement beyond that 6-month period?
So what the First Step Act did was it allowed people to earn time credits. So again, as I said earlier, those that are low or minimum risk, that complete programming and earn time credits, that time credits can be used to apply to pre-release custody or supervised release. So pre-release custody is both halfway house and home confinement. So it did expand the opportunity to be in a halfway house or in home confinement for a longer period of time based on those earned time credits. But the better opportunity, quite frankly, is to get the supervised release. I think something close to, I don't remember, 90% of the inmates that are sentenced in this country end up with supervised release anyway as part of their sentence. So this would get you moved from BOP custody to supervised release, which means you're no longer under the custody attorney general, and there are different restrictions. You're managed by the courts at that time, but it gets you into supervised release sooner, and that's, quite frankly, the better option of the two generally. It's possible under supervised release you may be in a halfway house or you may be at home. It varies.
While a person is in the halfway house, will that person continue to receive earned time credits that can apply to their sentence?
So this is one of those areas that has changed. BOP's initial interpretation of the First Step Act was that your earning of time credits stopped when you left BOP. And you had to be in a BOP facility to take programs and earn time credits. They issued a draft rule, which came out toward the end of the Trump administration. And in the intervening time, in working with the new administration, they issued a final rule a few months ago. And that final rule actually changed their interpretation and said that, yes, you could continue to earn time credits while in a halfway house. And so that's a significant change that allows people to continue to earn time credits. Now, getting in the time credits, helping them get to pre-release custody doesn't help because you're already in pre-release custody, but those time credits may help you get to supervised release sooner.
There's a big difference, of course, between serving the portion of your sentence in a halfway house and serving a portion of your sentence on home confinement with your family. And also people that are on home confinement have less exposure to the pandemic because they're in a halfway house, you're still confined with a lot of people. Are there mechanisms if the BOP sends a person under Second Chance Act to a halfway house, do mechanisms exist that by policy will allow that person to transition to home confinement, or do they have to stay in the halfway house for the length of time that the Bureau of Prisons sent them to a halfway house?
So normally, as you said earlier, somebody might go to a halfway house for the last year of their sentence, and then they'd be eligible for home confinement for the lesser of 6 months or 10% of their sentence. And so oftentimes in the ideal situation, right, the way prisons are designed to work is if you start at a high security facility, you would, work your way down, right? You'd work your way down to a medium, to a low, to a minimum, and then to a halfway house, and then to home confinement. And that's the process that is, in theory, designed to work. And to be fair, it doesn't always work that way. Now, obviously, not everybody is capable or able to work their way down. But so, yes, so somebody who's in the normal situation, they might be in an RRC for up to a year. And again, a year is probably not realistic for most people. BOP doesn't have enough halfway house capacity for that. Although the CARES Act, the pandemic and the CARES Act did open up some of that capacity because they pushed a lot of people out to home confinement under the CARES Act, opening up some additional bed space in those halfway houses. So their opportunity is there for some lengthier stays than normal. But I think when I was in BOP, the average stay in an RRC was 4 to 6 months. So you're already approaching your home confinement time. And so, but yes, the idea would be they would go into a RRC and then go to home confinement. And during the pandemic, we pushed many more out to home confinement because of the CARES Act, because that did change their eligibility criteria.
But for the individual that is in a halfway house and may be there for 6 months,
right,
does that person have an objective approach, even if he's earned time credits, to argue that he should transition to home confinement? Does that exist, or is that a subjective decision by the halfway house?
I mean, it is a subjective decision by the halfway house, but there are a number of things you can do to make sure that and to request that they consider you for that placement, right? You want to make sure that you have a job, right? If you're eligible to work, have a job. They're more like, because part of the things the halfway house does is help you find a job. So it's harder for them to do that if you're at home. So, the ability to get a job and have a job will hopefully speed that up. How much programming do you need? Mental health treatment do you need? Drug treatment do you need? How much of that are they doing in the halfway house versus in the community? Again, the less needs you have, the easier it is for them to move you to home confinement. What does your home look like, right? That's a big factor. They do a home inspection. If your home's a crack house, they're not going to send you to home confinement. What's the family situation there? So again, what's going on in the home can have a big impact on whether or not you get to home confinement. So those things are all looked at and considered by the RRC and the BOP before anybody's moved to home confinement. And so the more you can do to make sure that those things are in good order, you can help your case to go to home confinement.
And you said that it's subjective. If the halfway house keeps you in the halfway house, would the appropriate approach be for the person to file an administrative remedy to have the BOP review the decision?
Sure, they can do that. Again, you need to make sure that you meet all the criteria and what is the reason why they're holding you back. They're still managing you. The halfway house does get paid less when you're in home confinement, but usually there's plenty of people that BOP are pushing out into the halfway houses. They've had to make changes due to COVID, right? So they have, they've spread out. So they have fewer beds in some places. So they have less capacity in some of these halfway houses because of that as well.
So the other big change in the First Step Act is the Elderly Offender Program. Could you tell us about the Elderly Offender Program and if that's something that's new or newly administered because of the First Step Act?
So the Elderly Offender Program was a pilot program placed a number of years ago, and it wasn't really being used much. The First Step Act reauthorized that pilot program, which allows for certain inmates to be considered for home confinement sooner than the laws that we discussed earlier. The first change the First Step Act did was it changed. You have to be elderly, of course, it's the name of the program, but the First Step Act changed that from age 65 down to 60. So that opened the door to a greater number of people just based on that. The First Step Act and the Elderly Home Confinement Program require that you can't be convicted of certain crimes of violence. You can't be serving a life sentence. And you have to have served at least 2/3 of your sentence to be considered. And then the BOP has this kind of catch-all discretionary criteria that the BOP has to determine that placement in the Elderly Offender Program will not pose a risk to the public. Again, if you've not been convicted of a crime of violence and you're already eligible based on that, it's not likely BOP is going to find you to be a risk to the public unless your institutional conduct has been poor.
What is the elderly? What does it mean? Where does it transition you to? Is that to home confinement? What is the
home confinement? So this, when you talked before about the 6 months or 10% of your sentence, this allows somebody to go to home confinement for up to 1/3 of their sentence. So that could be potentially a much greater length of time.
Well, that concludes my series of questions on the First Step Act. And I appreciate you for spending time with us. I know that if I have some follow-ups, I'll try and reach out to you. If I'm going to try and publish this for people to receive and to get the benefit of learning from you. It's our hope at Prison Professors that people realize the importance of adjusting in a way that will qualify them for the maximum benefit. And it's much more important now because of the dynamic factors and the way that you adjust and can influence things. So I want to thank you for spending time with us on this subject. In the next series, I'd like to go into another subject that I think that is important to people going to prison, and that's designation and how does Grand Prairie score people. So stick with us, and we'll continue learning from Hugh Hurwitz, the former director of the Bureau of Prisons.
Great. Thank you.